Imagine this. You wake up in the Middle Ages. There are no smartphones, no electricity, not even a simple toothbrush. The streets are muddy, the air smells of smoke, dung and sweat, and everyone is staring at you. Why? Because you don't have what they call a title. In a society built on hierarchy, your entire existence depends on whether you are a lord, a knight, a priest, or a peasant. Titles aren't just fancy words here. They are life and death. Without one, you are nobody. Worse than nobody. You don't fit anywhere. You don't belong to the feudal order. That makes you suspicious, dangerous, and maybe even a criminal. So what happens to someone like you, a modern outsider, suddenly dropped into the medieval world with no land, no noble bloodline, no priestly robes, and no peasant's place in the fields? The truth is, you wouldn't last long. And tonight, we're going to walk through, step by step, what your life would look like if you time-traveled into the Middle Ages without a title. From the first suspicious stares in a muddy village, to the impossible challenges of finding food, avoiding punishment, and navigating the brutal social order that kept medieval Europe running. So get comfortable, because this is going to be a long and fascinating journey into the harsh, unforgiving, yet strangely captivating world of the Middle Ages. Arrival without a place. The first thing you would notice, stepping into the medieval world, is how deeply everyone belongs to a place. Villagers know their lord, lords know their peasants, priests know their flock, even beggars who sit by the church doors have a role that people recognize. But you have none of it. You don't carry the signs that tell people where you belong. No badge of service, no familiar family name, no village connection, no parish priest to vouch for you. In medieval Europe, belonging was everything. Without it, you were branded as a stranger, and strangers were dangerous. A man wandering without purpose could be a thief, a runaway serf, a spy from another lord's lands, or worse, someone cursed. From the very moment you walked into a medieval village, people would look at you with suspicion. They'd whisper. The women would gather their children. The men might confront you, demanding to know who you served. If you couldn't answer, if you had no lord, no title, no place, you would instantly be on the edge of survival. Food would not come easily. Taverns would not serve you unless you had money, and medieval coins weren't the kind you'd have in your pocket. You'd have no land to grow food, no craft guild to provide work. Even drinking water could be dangerous if you didn't know where to find the cleaner sources. And because you had no lord's protection, anyone could accuse you of wrongdoing. A stolen chicken, they'd point at the stranger. A missing loaf of bread, blame the outsider. In a world where law was local and justice was brutal, being without a title was like wearing a target on your back. But that's just the beginning. Because in the Middle Ages, life wasn't just about surviving from day to day. It was about fitting into a system. The great chain of being, as they called it. Without a rung to stand on, you'd find yourself constantly slipping further down, until there was nowhere left to fall. The village gates close. When you first approached a medieval village, you might expect a warm welcome. After all, modern travelers can drop by a small town and be met with curiosity or even hospitality. But in the Middle Ages, villagers were suspicious, even hostile, to strangers. Most villagers had some kind of barrier, not always a wall, but hedges, ditches, or wooden gates. These weren't just to keep animals in, they were to mark who belonged. If you stepped through those gates without someone to vouch for you, you'd instantly be noticed. The locals would not greet you with smiles. They'd glare, whisper, and sometimes even confront you outright. A peasant might step forward and ask, "Whose man are you?" meaning, who is your lord, who owns you? If you said, "No one," the atmosphere would darken. To them, that answer wasn't freedom, it was danger. A man without a master was like a wolf without a pack, unpredictable, and possibly violent. You'd find the innkeeper refusing you food, unless you produced coins he recognized. Merchants would turn away, saying they only traded with known folk. Even the church priests might hesitate, uncertain whether you were a genuine pilgrim or a fraud. In some cases, a stranger who lingered too long was treated harshly. Villagers had the right to chase you off, beat you, or drag you before their local bailiff. With no title, no land, and no lord, you had no one to defend you. You'd be at the mercy of their suspicion. So your first lesson in medieval survival would be brutal. The gates of society shut quickly on those who don't belong. Hunger in a world without options. Your stomach would quickly remind you that survival is about more than fitting in. It's about eating. In the modern world, you can walk into a store with cash, or even swipe a card. In the Middle Ages, that's impossible. Not only would your modern money be worthless, But even if you had the right coins, prices weren't made for wanderers. Food was tied to land, lordship, and obligation. Most peasants didn't buy bread. They baked their own with grain from the lord's fields. Meat was rare and carefully divided after hunts. Fish might be available, but often regulated by rights to rivers and lakes. Even gathering berries or firewood in a lord's forest could be a crime called poaching. For you, a landless outsider, that meant one thing: you had no right to food. You might beg outside a church, hoping for scraps from the charity of monks. But beggars weren't always welcome, and the competition was fierce. Many villagers already had their own poor, widows, orphans, cripples, who were tolerated because they belonged. You, on the other hand, would be seen as an intruder. Hunger would gnaw at you quickly, and unlike today, there was no corner bakery, no casual restaurant, no safe stream to drink from. Every bite of food and every drop of water was tied to ownership. To eat, you'd need to risk theft, beg shamelessly, or attach yourself to someone powerful. Without a title, even filling your stomach became a dangerous challenge. The suspicion of authority. If the villagers didn't trust you, the local authorities trusted you even less. Medieval society ran on a system of local law. The village reeve or bailiff kept watch over the peasants, making sure they worked the fields and paid their dues. Above him was the lord's steward, who visited to collect rents and enforce order. Then, of course, there were the sheriffs and royal officials in larger towns. Each of these figures had one main priority: to keep strangers under control. When you wandered into a medieval village without a title, you were effectively outside the law. If someone accused you of theft, you couldn't swear on your lord's name. If someone demanded your place of birth, you couldn't point to a recognized parish. You were a free target for punishment. Justice in this era wasn't gentle. At best, they might chase you away with threats. At worst, they could tie you to the stocks, flog you, or brand you as a vagabond. In England, by the late Middle Ages, laws against vagabonds and sturdy beggars were severe. A wandering man without a master was assumed to be lazy, criminal, or dangerous. Punishments could include whipping, mutilation, or being pressed into forced labor. So, from the very beginning of your medieval journey, you would realize this truth. Survival wasn't just about food. It was about avoiding notice. Because once the local authorities noticed you, your days were numbered. Sleeping under strange skies, night would bring its own terrors. In the modern world, even the homeless have some form of shelter in cities, bridges, stations, alleyways. But in the Middle Ages, shelter was tied to belonging. If you weren't inside the walls of a village, you were outside in the dark countryside. And that was no place for a stranger. Wolves still roamed in many regions. Bandits stalked the roads, ready to rob lonely travelers. The weather itself was harsh, with cold winds and damp earth that seeped into your bones. You might think of finding an abandoned barn, or curling up under a tree, but even that was risky. Sleeping on someone else's land without permission was trespassing, and trespassers were treated as thieves. A farmer could strike you down if he found you among his haystacks. There were no hotels, no safe hostels for casual guests. The only semi-safe option might be the church porch. Many churches had an open space where beggars and travelers could rest. But even there, you'd be exposed to the cold, the rats, and the suspicion of the locals who came to pray in the morning. In short, a single night in the medieval world without a title could feel endless. Hunger in your belly, cold in your bones, and the knowledge that at any moment, someone might decide you didn't belong. Clothes that betray you. The Middle Ages had strict rules about appearance. Clothing wasn't just about comfort. It was a social code. Every stitch you wore revealed who you were, where you belonged, and what rank you held. As a time traveler, you'd already be doomed. If you arrived in modern clothes, you'd stick out instantly. Strange fabrics, odd colors, seams that no medieval tailor had ever stitched. Villagers would eye you with suspicion, whispering that you were bewitched, cursed, or a thief who stole garments from another land. Even if you somehow scavenged peasant clothes, your body would still betray you. Your posture, your skin, even your hands would look wrong. Medieval peasants had calloused palms, bent backs, and rough-hewn faces from a lifetime of hard labor. You, with your modern smoothness, would look suspiciously soft. And remember, in many towns, laws called sumptuary laws dictated exactly what colors and fabrics people could wear. Only nobles could wear silk or fur. Merchants might wear finer wool. Peasants wore drab, homespun cloth. If you mismatched your outfit even slightly, people would notice, and accuse you of pretending to be something you weren't. In short, clothing in the Middle Ages wasn't protection, it was evidence. And as someone without a title, your very shirt could betray you. Language as a wall. You might think you could survive by blending in, keeping quiet, and copying others. But sooner or later, you'd need to speak, and when you opened your mouth, your fate would be sealed. The English of the Middle Ages wasn't the English you know. Step into a 13th century village and say, "Hello, can you help me?" And you'd be met with blank stares. At best, they'd catch a few words. At worst, they'd think you were speaking gibberish. Middle English sounded alien, full of rolled R's, unfamiliar vowels, and strange grammar. Even in France, Italy, or Germany, each region had its own dialects, so thick and local that a traveler from just a few villages away might be incomprehensible. For you, with your modern accent, you'd be an outsider the second you spoke. Some might think you were foreign, and foreigners were often distrusted, even hated. Others might suspect you of being a spy. The irony is, silence wouldn't save you either. If you refused to speak, villagers might assume you were a mute, or worse, bewitched. Either way, language was a wall you could not climb. Without a title to vouch for you, your tongue would betray you as surely as your clothes. The brutality of work. Let's say, against all odds, a villager took pity on you and offered work. That might sound like salvation, but in reality, it would be another nightmare. Medieval work wasn't like a modern job. There were no breaks, no contracts, no wages as you'd understand them. If you were put to work in the fields, you'd be expected to toil from sunrise to sunset, bending, lifting, hauling, with no tools designed for comfort. Your body, untrained for such labor, would give out quickly. Blisters would form, muscles would tear, and sunburn would scorch your skin. The peasants beside you, hardened from childhood, would sneer at your weakness, and once you faltered you'd be cast aside. Worthless to them, and perhaps beaten for wasting their time. And remember, without a title, you had no protection. Lords and overseers could demand your service, pay you little or nothing, and then drive you away. You couldn't appeal to any law. To them, you were disposable. In the Middle Ages, work wasn't just hard, it was survival, and you, the outsider, would fail at it almost immediately. The church as judge. If villagers couldn't decide what to make of you, it would turn to the one institution that dominated every life, the church. You might find yourself dragged before a priest. He would demand your name, your birthplace, your faith, and here your modern answers would betray you again. Religion in the Middle Ages wasn't casual. It was the very heartbeat of existence. Every person belonged to a parish, baptized as a child, married under holy rites, and buried in consecrated ground. To admit you had no parish, no baptism, no record, that was terrifying. It suggested you were outside God's order, perhaps even marked by the devil. At best, the priest might demand you prove your faith by reciting prayers in Latin that you wouldn't know. At worst, he might call for penance, or worse still, trial. Medieval trials could involve ordeals plunging your hand into boiling water, carrying hot iron, or being thrown into a river to see if you floated. With no title, no parish, and no history, the church would see you as a threat to the Holy Order. And in the Middle Ages, the church's suspicion was often a death sentence. Disease and the strangest curse. Even if you somehow avoided suspicion, hunger and punishment, another enemy lurked, disease. Medieval people were deeply suspicious of illness, and they often blamed strangers for bringing it. A coughing outsider might be accused of carrying plague. A pale face could spark whispers of curses or witchcraft. In your modern immune system, it wouldn't help. In fact, it might betray you. You'd have no natural resistance to medieval strains of disease, parasites, or even foodborne illnesses. A simple meal of contaminated bread or a drink from a dirty stream could kill you in days. Meanwhile, your own hygiene, or lack of it, would make you stand out. Without regular baths, medieval people carried their own smells, but it was a familiar smell. You, sweating in fear, sleeping in ditches, and eating what scraps you found, would smell different, strange, unclean in a way they couldn't place. And in a world where sickness was often linked to sin, being ill as a stranger was almost as dangerous as being caught stealing. The weight of taxes. Surviving as a landless peasant was not just about food and shelter, it was also about taxes. Medieval taxation was a net cast over every villager, and for someone without a title, you'd be expected to pay dues, whether you had the means or not. Peasants owed grain to their lord, livestock to their manor, and a portion of nearly everything to the church. There were tithes, rents, tolls for crossing bridges, and fees for grinding flour at the lord's mill. Nothing was free. As a time traveler without land or a family, you'd have no income, and yet tax collectors didn't care. You might be ordered to hand over chickens, a sack of barley, or labor on the Lord's fields as payment. Failure to comply could mean punishment, imprisonment, or even branding as a vagabond. And the cruelest irony, even if you worked yourself nearly to death for scraps, most of what you earned would be taken from you. You would live hungry, and still, you would owe justice without mercy. In the Middle Ages, justice was not blind, it was brutal, and it was stacked against those without a title. If accused of theft, lying, or simply looking suspicious, you could be hauled before the local court. But these courts were not designed to protect you, they were designed to preserve order. As someone without land, without family ties, without reputation, you would have no witnesses to defend you, no one to swear an oath of your good character, and without oaths you had only one option: trial by ordeal. That might mean plunging your arm into boiling water and seeing if it healed clean, carrying red-hot iron a certain number of paces, or being thrown into a river, where sinking meant innocence, and floating meant guilt. Surviving such ordeals was rare, and even if you lived, the scars would mark you as cursed. To walk through the Middle Ages without a title was to walk always one accusation away from ruin. The hunger season. Modern people rarely think about hunger as a cycle, but in the Middle Ages, hunger came every year, and it came with a name: the Hungry Gap. Between planting in spring and the first harvest in late summer, food supplies dwindled, grain stores rotted, meat spoiled, and peasants lived on scraps of barley bread stretched with weeds and acorns. As a time traveler, you would arrive with no stored food at all. Villagers might feed you for a day, maybe two, but not for long. In the hungry season, every mouth was a burden. Outsiders were often the first to be turned away. Desperate, you might try to forage, but without medieval knowledge, you would struggle to tell edible herbs from poisonous ones. A handful of the wrong berries could end your journey before it began. For those without a title, hunger was not a possibility, it was a guarantee. Winter, the silent executioner. If summer threatened starvation, winter promised slow death. Peasants in the Middle Ages lived in small wooden huts, often with a thatched roof and little insulation. Firewood was scarce, blankets were thin, families huddled together for warmth with their animals inside. As a traveler, alone and without kin, you would face the cold with nothing. No supplies of salted pork, no stores of ale, no heavy wool cloaks to wrap around you. Frostbite would gnaw at your fingers, smoke from poor chimneys would choke your lungs, and illness, coughs, fevers, infections, would sweep through huts like wildfire in the cold. For nobles, castles offered stone walls, fur blankets, and warm hearths. For peasants, survival meant sheer endurance, but for you, the stranger without title or family, the winter would be a silent executioner. The fear of wolves and strangers. The Middle Ages were not just ruled by men, but by the wilderness beyond the village. Forests were thick, dark, and alive with threat. Wolves prowled, and even if they rarely attacked humans, the fear of them was constant. Travelers disappeared on roads, bandits hid in the trees, spirits and demons, so the villagers believed, lingered at the edges of the woods. As a time traveler, you would be seen as part of that danger. You came from nowhere, you had no roots, and that made you suspect. Villagers often drove strangers out of town with stones, fearing they carried curses, or worse, were werewolves in disguise. The irony is that you, hunted and alone, might actually flee to the forest for safety. But in the Middle Ages, the woods offered no refuge, only hunger, cold, and eyes glowing in the dark. Tools of pain. If you thought punishments in the Middle Ages were harsh, the tools designed for them were worse. The pillory, a wooden frame that locked your head and hands, was not just about humiliation. It left you exposed to the public, to spit, to rotting vegetables, even to stones thrown by angry villagers. The stocks clamped your legs, forcing you to sit in the dirt for hours or days. The scolds, bridle, an iron cage around the head, crushed the jaw of anyone accused of speaking out of turn. And if you were labeled a vagabond, the punishment could be branding, a hot iron pressed to your face or hands, marking you forever. For nobles, punishment was often fines or exile. For the titleless, it was pain. Your lack of status meant your body itself became the canvas of justice, work of the devil. In the Middle Ages, anything unexplained was often blamed on the devil. Strange clothes, strange speech, strange behavior, all could be read as signs of witchcraft or possession. If you stumbled into a village muttering in fear, villagers might believe you cursed their livestock or soured their milk. If crops failed, they might accuse you of bringing misfortune. Priests and inquisitors would see you as a test. Were you a messenger of Satan, a wandering sorcerer, or a soul to be cleansed through fire and confession? Without a title to protect you, suspicion alone was enough. You might find yourself tied to a post, the crowd circling, torches in hand. The Middle Ages feared the devil everywhere, and you, the outsider, would be his perfect vessel. The peasant's diet of dirt. Food in the Middle Ages was more punishment than pleasure. For peasants, meals meant bread, porridge, and more bread. Occasionally beans or cabbage, but rarely meat. Bread itself was often adulterated, stretched with sand, dust, or ground up bark to make it last longer. Eating too much could wear down teeth until they cracked. As a modern traveler used to balanced meals, your body would revolt. Malnutrition would set in quickly. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C, weakness from lack of protein, and water, rarely safe. People drank weak ale because it was boiled in brewing. But for you, unaccustomed to such a diet, even ale might sicken you. Food would not save you in the Middle Ages. It would weaken you, starve you, and slowly grind you down. No healer for the poor. If sickness struck you, as it surely would, there would be little hope. Medieval medicine was crude, often dangerous, and always divided by class. Nobles might summon a physician trained in humors, prescribing bleeding, purging, or strange concoctions of herbs and metals. But peasants, they relied on wise women, charms, and the hope of prayer. For you, the outsider, there would be no healer at all. No family to brew a poultice, no lord to call a doctor. You would lie on a straw mat, writhing, while villagers whispered that your illness was punishment from God. And even if someone did attempt to help, their cures could be worse than the disease. Leeches, cauterization, or swallowing ground-up metals. Each treatment more deadly than the last. In the Middle Ages, the poor were not cured. They were buried. The endless war, perhaps the greatest threat of all, was war. The Middle Ages were never far from battle, whether between rival lords, invading armies, or raiding bandits. For peasants, war was a disaster. Fields were burned, livestock stolen, and homes destroyed. Armies marched through villages, taking food, conscripting men, and leaving devastation behind. As a traveler without a title, you would have no protection. You could be seized as a laborer to dig trenches, or worse, as cannon fodder in battle. And if you tried to flee, you would be cut down as a deserter or thief. In a world where war never truly ended, you would be trapped between armies, with no banner, no allegiance, and no chance of safety. The Church's watchful eye. In the Middle Ages, religion was everywhere. The church was not just a place of prayer, but the backbone of law, culture, and survival. And for someone without a title, the church's watchful eye was not a comfort. It was a constant threat. The priest knew every villager by name. He knew who attended mass, who confessed their sins, who paid their tithes, and who lingered too long at the tavern. Strangers were different. Strangers were suspicious. If you stumbled into town unable to recite the Lord's Prayer in Latin, the priest might immediately question your soul. Worse, the church controlled the very rhythm of life. Feast days and fast days dictated diets, work schedules, even marriage beds. To eat meat on a Friday was a sin. To skip mass was a sin. And sins, if left unconfessed, could cost you dearly. For nobles, fines could absolve guilt. For the titleless, confession could mean public humiliation, floggings, or forced pilgrimages to distant shrines. And if you resisted, heresy, that single word could end with you bound to a stake. A stranger in the market. Markets were the heart of medieval towns. They bustled with life. Stalls of bread, wheels of cheese, smoked fish, bolts of cloth. The air was thick with the sound of barter, the clink of coins, the cries of sellers. But step into that market as a traveler without title or kin, and you would be an immediate target. Merchants were trained to spot the unfamiliar. Your accent would betray you. Your clothing would set you apart. Even the way you handled a coin might give you away. You would be charged higher prices, cheated with false weights, or simply denied service altogether. And if someone accused you of theft, the mob would not hesitate. Justice in the market was swift, often decided by the crowd before the court. Markets were not just centers of trade. They were theaters of gossip and suspicion. A lone figure without ties would stand out like a wound, and in the Middle Ages, wounds were not left untreated, they were cut out. The curse of the outlaw. To be an outlaw in the Middle Ages was not just to be a criminal, it was to be erased from society. If you were caught stealing food, trespassing on a noble's land, or simply refusing to pay taxes, the Lord could declare you an outlaw. This meant no one could offer you shelter, food, or protection. You were fair game. Anyone could harm you, even kill you without punishment. As a time traveler without title, the risk of outlawry hung heavy over you. You had no allies to plead your case, no lord to shield you, no land to prove your loyalty. One mistake, one accusation, and you could be condemned to wander the forests, hunted like an animal. Outlaws in stories, like Robin Hood, were romantic. In reality, they were skeletal figures, filthy and desperate, hounded until they starved or were strung up on the gallows. To be without title in the Middle Ages was to always stand one step from that abyss: filth, fleas, and disease. You might imagine that the greatest danger in the Middle Ages came from swords or wars. But the truth, the deadliest enemy was filth. Villages had no plumbing. Waste was dumped into ditches, sometimes into the same streams used for drinking. Streets reeked of rot, and homes were filled with smoke, mold, and damp straw crawling with insects. Fleas carried plague, lice spread fevers, rats feasted in grain stores. As a traveler with no permanent shelter, you would lie in the filthiest corners: barns, ditches, the floors of taverns. Disease would find you quickly, and once it did, you'd have no resistance. Diarrhea, infected wounds, fevers that racked the body, all were killers. Without medicine, without family care, you would waste away in silence, while villagers muttered that your death was proof of your cursed foreign nature. The fear of fire. We think of fire as a source of warmth and comfort, but in the Middle Ages, fire was also one of the greatest fears. Villages were made of timber and thatch. One spark, one overturned lantern, and an entire settlement could vanish in smoke. Lords imposed strict fire rules: no flames after dusk, no untended hearths. But rules did not stop disaster. As a newcomer, if fire broke out near you, suspicion would fall instantly at your feet. The stranger did it, the villagers would say, because fear always seeks an outsider to blame. Whether true or not, you might be seized, beaten, and executed for arson. Fire was not just a risk to the home, it was a weapon of punishment. Heretics were burned, witches were burned, and the spectacle was meant to remind everyone: fire purifies. For someone without a title, fire was not warmth, it was judgment, the burden of the Lord's command. Life in the Middle Ages was not lived freely, it was lived under obligation. Peasants owed their lords not just taxes but labor, as it was called. A certain number of days each year were set aside, not for tending your own crops, but for working the Lord's fields. Imagine being a stranger, with no land to tend and no family to defend you. You might be pressed into these duties anyway, treated as an extra pair of hands to plow, harvest, or haul timber. Refuse, and you would be beaten. Resist further, and you could be chained. The Lord's word was law. If he decided you were useful, you were useful. If he decided you were worthless, you were discarded. Without a title, your body was just another tool to be worked until it broke. Festivals of fear and frenzy. Not all medieval life was toil. There were festivals, feast days filled with music, dancing, masks, and ale. To a traveler, these might look like moments of joy, but beneath the surface, they could be deadly. Festivals often involved ritual humiliations. Strangers might be mocked, dressed as fools, or chased through the village as scapegoats for the year's misfortunes. Drinking made crowds unpredictable, jests turned violent, and religion always lurked in the background. If someone fell ill after a festival, blame might fall on the outsider who danced too wildly or whispered strange words. In the chaos of celebration, you could easily become the sacrifice that bound the community tighter together. Festivals were not safety, they were danger dressed in ribbons. The weight of silence. In the Middle Ages, words had power. An oath sworn before God could bind you for life. A rumor could destroy your reputation forever. For someone without title or family, silence became both shield and curse. If you spoke too much, your strange speech marked you as foreign. If you spoke too little, your silence was proof of deceit. Villagers would whisper, "Why does he hide his tongue? What is he hiding?" And so you would carry the weight of silence, never knowing when a word could betray you, but also knowing that saying nothing invited suspicion. In a world where survival depended on reputation, silence could be as dangerous as speech. Shadows of the gallows. Every village lived under the shadow of the gallows. Wooden frames stood on hillsides or near crossroads, grim reminders of the price of crime. Sometimes the bodies of executed criminals were left to rot, swinging in the wind, bones picked clean by crows. For villagers, the gallows were both deterrent and spectacle. For you, the outsider, they were a warning. Step too far out of line, and that rope could be yours. Even minor crimes, theft of bread, poaching a rabbit, could earn death if you lacked protection. Nobles might walk free for murder, but a title a stranger. The gallows waited eagerly. The Middle Ages made examples of the weak, and as a traveler you would be the weakest of all. The endless night. When the sun went down in the Middle Ages, true darkness fell. No streetlights, no lamps, except the occasional flicker of a candle or torch. The night belonged to shadows and to fears. Villagers locked their doors tight. Wolves howled in the distance. Thieves crept along empty roads. Witches, it was said, met in the fields to dance with demons under the moonlight. As an outsider, you would have nowhere to retreat, no door to bolt, no hearth to gather by. The night would swallow you whole, every rustle of the wind a threat, every crack of a branch the promise of a lurking figure. The endless night was not a pause in the Middle Ages, it was a battlefield of fear, and without title or home, you would fight it alone. The trial by ordeal. Justice in the Middle Ages was not about fairness, it was about divine judgment. Courts often turned to something called trial by ordeal. The idea was simple. God would reveal the truth through suffering. If someone accused you of theft or witchcraft, you might be forced to plunge your hand into boiling water. The wound would be wrapped, and after 3 days, the priest would inspect it. If it was healing cleanly, God had protected you. You were innocent. If not, you were guilty. Other ordeals were no less brutal. Some involved walking barefoot across red-hot plowshares. Others meant being tied and thrown into a river. If you floated, the water had rejected you, proving guilt. If you sank and drowned, well, you died innocent. For someone without title or reputation, being accused meant you had almost no chance of avoiding these ordeals. Nobles could pay their way out, priests could lean on the church's favor, but you were a stranger, a convenient victim for divine truth. Hunger as a weapon. Food was never guaranteed in the Middle Ages. Famines swept across Europe regularly, and even good years brought lean months when last season's stores ran low. But hunger was more than an accident. It was a weapon. Lords controlled grain supplies. Bakers were regulated. Their ovens watched closely. Anyone accused of hoarding or stealing food faced brutal punishments, hands cut off, public whipping, or worse. As an outsider, you would never be first in line for bread. Villagers might chase you away from their granaries, fearing you'd eat what little they had. During famine, the weakest went first. Foreigners, beggars, orphans, widows. Those without ties to a household starved before the Lord ever went hungry. And famine was not just absence of food, it twisted society. Parents abandoned children, entire villages rioted. Cannibalism was whispered about in the worst years. To arrive without title, without protection, was to stand at the bottom of the food chain, in every sense. The branding iron. The medieval world loved visible punishment. It wasn't enough to fine a thief or flog a drunkard. The body itself became a canvas of shame. Thieves might be branded with a hot iron, letters seared into their flesh, a T for thief, an M for murderer. Others had ears cut off, noses slit, or fingers removed. These mutilations weren't just pain, they were permanent marks, ensuring that no one would forget your crime. For the titleless, the risk was even greater. With no lord to protect you, false accusations could stick. One fight, one bad word, and suddenly you might be branded for life. The burn would mark you forever as an outcast. Imagine arriving in a medieval village scarred by the iron. Every glance would remind you that you were no longer a stranger. You were a criminal in the eyes of all. The world of work. Without title, survival meant labor. Endless backbreaking labor. Peasants rose with the dawn and worked until dusk, bending over fields, carrying buckets of water, hauling timber. Their hands were blistered, their backs bent, their lives measured in seasons of planting and harvest. And you, the traveler, would be no exception. You would be pressed into service wherever hands were needed, clearing rocks from fields, threshing wheat, mucking stables, or digging trenches. Payment would be scraps of food, perhaps a corner of a barn to sleep in, and unlike villagers, who at least had family ties, you had nothing. No one to share the load, no children to help, no wife to spin or cook. Every ounce of survival depended on your own body, and when that body broke, no one would care. The Middle Ages were not a world for dreamers, they were a world for laborers, and you would quickly learn which one you were. The language barrier. We often forget that the Middle Ages were a Tower of Babel. Every region had its own dialect, sometimes so different that neighboring villages struggled to understand one another. Arrive in France, and villagers might speak a mix of Old French and local tongue. Wander into Germany, and you'd find yourself lost in a maze of Middle High German. Even in England, Old English and Early Middle English varied from shire to shire. Without title, your strange words would mark you instantly. People might assume you were foreign, or worse, that you were lying. Misunderstandings could spiral into danger. A slip of the tongue mistaken for heresy, a poorly chosen word sounding like insult. Language was not just communication, it was survival. And as a traveler, your accent alone might be the first noose around your neck. The Inquisition's shadow. By the later Middle Ages, the Church had sharpened its claws. The Inquisition spread across Europe, rooting out heresy with ruthless efficiency. To the Inquisitors, heresy was not just wrong belief. It was a cancer that could destroy all of Christendom, and they hunted it with interrogations, torture, and public executions. A traveler without ties was the perfect suspect. Why were you here? Why did you know strange things? Why did you carry odd objects? Questions piled upon questions, and answers rarely satisfied. Once accused, you would face torture designed to extract confession, stretched on the rack until bones cracked, crushed beneath iron weights, suspended by your arms until shoulders tore. And once you confessed, no matter the truth, you would burn. The Middle Ages were a world where belief was enforced with fire. Without a title, you would have no shield against the flames. The burden of taxes. It is often said that medieval peasants were crushed by taxes, and it is true. Lords demanded rents, kings demanded levies, the church demanded tithes. There was always another hand reaching into your pocket. As a stranger, you had no exemptions. In fact, you were more likely to be overtaxed, milked for whatever coin or goods you carried. Officials might accuse you of owing back taxes simply because you could not prove otherwise. And taxes weren't just money. They were labor, livestock, even children pressed into service. In desperate times, a lord might seize your ox, your tools, or your only means of survival. For those without title, taxation was not a system. It was a weapon, a slow bleed that left you weaker every season, until hunger or debt swallowed you whole. The fear of witchcraft. In the Middle Ages, unexplained misfortune always had a culprit. Witches, a failed harvest, a sick cow, a dying child. Someone had cursed the village, and who better to blame than the stranger? You spoke oddly, dressed strangely, carried unfamiliar tools, all signs of dark magic. Accusations spiraled quickly. You might be subjected to the swimming test, bound and thrown into water to see if you floated, or you might face torture until you named accomplices. And if you survived, your life would be spent under constant suspicion. The fear of witchcraft was not just superstition, it was a social safety valve, a way to channel fear and rage into sacrifice. And without title or protection, you would be the sacrifice. The road of thieves. Travel in the Middle Ages was not safe. Roads were little more than muddy tracks, often cutting through dense forests. And forests were home not just to wolves, but to bandits. Bands of thieves roamed, preying on travelers. Merchants traveled in groups, guarded by armed men, but you, without title or companions, would be easy prey. Your clothes, your few coins, even your shoes could be stripped from you. And if bandits didn't take you, the toll collectors might. Lords built castles along roads to extort travelers, demanding payment to pass. Refusal meant prison, or worse. The Middle Ages were not a world you could simply wander. Every road was a gamble, and for someone alone, the odds were against you. The endless war. Perhaps the greatest threat of all was war. The Middle Ages were soaked in conflict. Feuds between nobles, peasant uprisings, endless campaigns between kingdoms. War did not just happen on battlefields. Armies marched through villages, seizing food, burning homes, conscripting men. To a lord, you were nothing but another body to throw into the fight. If you refused, you could be executed. If you fought, you might die on muddy ground, pierced by arrows or crushed beneath horses. And if you survived, disease in the camp would likely finish what the battle began. War was constant, unpredictable, and merciless. For nobles, it was a chance for glory. For peasants, it was ruin. For you, without title, it was a death sentence waiting to be called. The plague and the stranger. Few things were more terrifying in the Middle Ages than disease. The Black Death alone wiped out nearly half of Europe in the 14th century, but plagues, fevers, and mysterious illnesses haunted every generation. Villagers were quick to blame outsiders for outbreaks. If you appeared shortly before a rash of deaths, suspicion would fall squarely on you. People whispered of poisoned wells, cursed breath, or travelers carrying demonic infection. Even if you weren't accused, survival was almost impossible. Quarantines, sealed villages, doctors bled patients with rusty knives or forced them to inhale foul-smelling herbs. Corpses piled in shallow pits. Rats scuttled across churchyards. and as a stranger you'd have nowhere to turn. Families cared for their own first. Priests gave last rites, but bread and shelter were reserved for those within the community. You wouldn't just be vulnerable to disease, you'd be vulnerable to the fear that disease provoked, and fear could kill as surely as plague. The harsh winter. The Middle Ages had no central heating, no insulation, and no easy comforts when winter came. A bad winter could freeze rivers solid, collapse roofs under snow, and kill livestock by the thousands. For villagers, survival meant stockpiled firewood, smoked meats, root vegetables buried deep in cellars. But you, a titleless traveler, would have none of that. You'd beg for scraps, shiver in a barn if you were lucky, and wake with frostbite if you weren't. Monasteries sometimes offered bread to strangers, but their own supplies were thin, and hospitality could vanish in famine years. Even clothing was a challenge. Wool tunics and fur-lined cloaks were expensive. Peasants wore patched garments until they disintegrated. You'd be exposed, poorly dressed, and constantly vulnerable to the cold, and in the cold, despair set in. Nights stretched endlessly. Villagers muttered of wolves at the edge of forests, of spirits haunting snow-swept roads. Winter wasn't just weather, it was a force of death, pressing down on all. The burden of the Lord's forest. Forests in the Middle Ages were not free spaces. They were controlled by lords and kings, and harsh laws governed every tree and animal. The forest law meant hunting deer or even gathering firewood without permission could lead to brutal punishment. Cutting down a tree might cost you your hand. Killing a deer could cost you your life. For villagers, this was oppressive but at least familiar. They knew how to skirt the rules. They knew which gamekeepers might be bribed. But you, the traveler, would be obvious. A stranger in the Lord's forest, carrying sticks or a rabbit, would be presumed guilty. And yet, without access to the forest, survival was nearly impossible. No firewood, no food, no shelter. You would face a cruel choice: starve in obedience, or risk your life by breaking the Lord's law. The punishment of stocks and pillory. Public humiliation was a cornerstone of medieval justice. If you were caught stealing, lying, or simply offending the wrong person, you might be locked in the stocks or pillory. These wooden frames held your head and hands, or your feet, trapping you in the town square. There the entire community became your tormentors. Children hurled mud, women spat curses. Men pelted you with rotten food, stones, even excrement. Sometimes the punishment lasted hours, sometimes days. Sun burned your skin, rain soaked you to the bone. Rats nibbled the scraps beneath your feet, and when it ended you carried the shame forever. For someone without a title, this punishment was doubly dangerous. Villagers had no reason to hold back. You weren't one of them. You were an intruder, and the pillory was their chance to remind you that you didn't belong. The world of ale and bread. Food and drink were not just survival in the Middle Ages, they were identity. Bread was called the staff of life, and ale was safer than water. But both were tightly regulated. Bakers were punished for selling underweight loaves, brewers were monitored for weak or overpriced ale. Yet even with regulation, shortages were constant, and the poor often survived on the coarsest rye bread, dark and bitter, mixed with chaff or ground beans. As a traveler, you would never be offered the fine white bread reserved for nobles or clergy. You'd get the scraps. Crusts so hard they cracked teeth, ale so sour it curdled your stomach, and in famine years, even that might be denied. Villagers looked after their kin first. The stranger came last, if at all. Bread and ale weren't just food, they were lines of belonging, and you would find yourself always on the wrong side of those lines. The endless toll of bells. In every medieval village, bells marked the rhythm of life. They rang for church services, for curfews, for danger, for funerals. Their sound was constant, a reminder that every moment was owned by someone higher: the priest, the lord, the king, God himself. For locals, the bells were familiar, even comforting. For you, they would be alien, a relentless sound enforcing rules you barely understood. Miss a curfew bell, and you might be accused of plotting theft. Ignore the call to mass, and suspicion of heresy could fall on you. And the funeral bells rang often. Death was constant, and each toll reminded the community of their fragility. To be outside that community, to hear bells for others, but know none would toll for you, was a reminder of your alienation. The bells were not just sound, they were control. The dangers of medieval medicine. If you fell ill or injured, medieval medicine offered little hope. Treatments revolved around the balance of four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Remedies included bloodletting with leeches, purging with laxatives, or applying animal dung to wounds. Wealthier folk might consult physicians, but their treatments were often as deadly as the disease. Poorer folk relied on herbalists and wise women, whose cures were a mix of superstition and practical knowledge. As a stranger, you would face both cost and suspicion. Why would anyone waste precious herbs on you? Why would they risk accusations of witchcraft by treating someone unknown? And so, even a small wound could be your undoing. A cut could fester, a fever could burn unchecked. Medicine in the Middle Ages was not healing. It was a gamble, and for the titleless, the dice were loaded against you. The shadow of serfdom, the backbone of the medieval world, was serfdom. Peasants legally bound to their lord's land. Serfs worked fields, paid rents, and owed labor services, unable to leave without permission. As a stranger, you risked being pressed into this system. A lord might claim you as a runaway serf, forcing you into bondage. With no documents, no family to vouch for you, you could not prove otherwise. Once bound, escape was nearly impossible. Manhunters tracked runaway serfs. Punishments included flogging, branding, or mutilation. And freedom was rare, reserved for those who could flee to a chartered town and survive there for a year and a day. Without a title, you were property waiting to be claimed, and the Lord's word outweighed yours every time. The weight of religion. The Middle Ages were a world where faith was inescapable. Every day began with prayer, every meal blessed, every event marked by the church. Religion wasn't private belief, it was public law. As a stranger, you would be judged on your piety. Fail to cross yourself at the right moment, and eyes would narrow. Mispronounce the Latin of the Lord's Prayer, and whispers would rise. Miss Mass, and you might be dragged before the priest for questioning. Religion offered comfort to the faithful, but to outsiders, it was surveillance. Every move measured, every word weighed. And with the Inquisition and heresy trials lurking in the background, a single mistake could doom you. In the Middle Ages, faith was not optional. It was a chain, binding everyone, and without title, the chain was pulled tighter around your neck. The end of the road. At last, consider the end of your medieval journey. You've faced famine, plague, suspicion, and endless labor. Perhaps you've survived, scarred and weary, but survival itself might be the cruelest outcome. The Middle Ages offered no upward path for the titleless. Nobility was inherited, not earned. Wealth flowed upward, not downward. You could toil your entire life and still die in the same mud you arrived in. And when death came, your burial would be shallow, your grave unmarked. No bells would toll. No records would preserve your name. The stranger who appeared and endured would vanish as though they had never been. This was the true fate of arriving in the Middle Ages without a title. Not just suffering, but erasure. A life lived in the margins, forgotten by all, swallowed by time. And so, after endless time of wandering through the muddy roads, frozen winters, plague-ridden villages, and suffocating walls of the medieval world, one truth stands clear. If you time-traveled to the Middle Ages without a title, you would not be a knight, a lord, or even a respected villager. You would be no one, a stranger, nameless, voiceless, without rights, and without mercy. You would face hunger until your ribs pressed through your skin. You would kneel under the endless demands of lords and priests. You would beg for scraps of bread, hide from plague carts, and sleep with one eye open, fearing wolves in the woods and knives in the dark. And the worst part, you wouldn't be remembered. Not in chronicles, not in ballads, not even in the whispers of future generations. You would die the way you lived in the Middle Ages, erased. The kings, queens, knights, and bishops may dominate the history books, but it was the titleless millions, the forgotten masses, who truly carried that world on their backs. Their suffering is what built castles, tilled fields, and raised cathedrals that still stand today. And yet, their names are dust. If this journey into the forgotten shadows of history has fascinated you, if you've felt the weight of that world pressing against your imagination, then don't let the story end here. Hit that subscribe button to keep exploring the hidden, bizarre, and brutal corners of history with us. Give this video a like if you'd never survive a week in the Middle Ages, and drop a comment below. What would be your very first mistake in a medieval village? Would it be eating the wrong food, missing a bell, or offending the wrong lord? This is just one tale among countless forgotten realms of the past, and every week we'll dig deeper into the strange, the dark, and the secrets history tried to bury. Thank you for surviving with us this long. Until next time, beware of the bells, watch the shadows, and remember, history is never as clean, peaceful, or noble as it seems.